to start. I think Windows is now ready to let us all start the day. Welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to end the Open Week this autumn term at the AA with this event, with this day-long symposium titled Cities from Zero. It's obviously a great topic. In my view, the history of interesting architectural ideas can be found in two contexts. One is cities, and the other is books. And one of the nice things about this event is it'll bring both together, and that this will be put together as a book in the next couple of months' time that we'll be publishing in the new year that will document the day's proceedings. It's a great group of people, 6 people that have been brought in to speak on the topic of the slightly peculiar circumstances of contemporary urbanism in the city. A century ago, as a discipline called modern architecture was created, urbanism in the city was treated very much as a kind of neutral context within which the avant-garde could operate. Today, what's so fascinating is, of course, anything we call architecture has morphed over rather seamlessly into cities themselves as a kind of project. Like many people in this room, I, as an architect, have worked on cities as if they were buildings. I got a fax one night in New York 10 years ago from a client who asked if we could do a new sister city for the capital of Thailand, and could we fax something through on the following Tuesday, which was about the time many of us started to realize the circumstances of cities were changing radically in the way we think about them as architects. It's really a spectacular group of people that have been brought in today to talk about the topic around a range of disciplines in relation to cities, not just architecture, but photographers, theorists, and others that'll take the topic on. It's really just an opportunity here to welcome all of you. I think it should be a great day's discussion. Please join in the conversation as a part of this. It's all being documented and recorded. Katharina and Shumon have put together a great event for us. And please enjoy the topic and help us work on the problems and the possibilities of cities in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brett. Sorry again for the slight delay in kicking off this this morning. My name's Shumon Basar. Along with Katharina Borsi, we're co-organised this symposium today, and we've been curating one of these research clusters, which have been one of the new initiatives that Brett sort of kicked off last year, which are an attempt to sort of cut through the various strata of the AA's sort of territories of pedagogy and approach, and try and look at some perhaps themes or of consistency that we all deal with in different ways. And the way in which Katharina and I, in kind of guiding our cluster over the last year, have attempted to do this, been sort of a series of sort of events like this, in a sense, where we started out last spring somehow looking at how the issue of scale might relate to engagement when we talk about the city, i.e., I think if you go through the various units and programs within the AA, you'll notice that many people are talking about the city, how they approach that, what they consider to be the city, what they consider to be a kind of... By the way, people at the back, there are some seats here at the front in the North Jury Room. And so this notion of how we might sort of physically, politically, and experientially relate the notion of a certain legitimate scale, be that 1 to 1 or 1 to 100,000, with a certain kind of engagement, was something we did in a very modest but incredibly revealing way, I think last spring, which got published as a small book. And then we thought that as a counterpart then to much of the sort of already established body of knowledge on historical cities, be they the West and in the East, that scrutiny should be directed towards a category of what we might call a collective global ignorance. Cities from Zero is the name we've given to the contemporary species of urbanization taking place most fervently in the Middle and in the Far East. They're the urban equivalent of Porsches or Ferraris in terms of sheer acceleration. Cities from Zero are visionary realms fueled by specific economic and political factors that are also symptoms of a shared globalization. Perhaps many of you are aware that for the first time in history, some point during this year, more than half of the people in the world now live in cities. This isn't about to going to rewind. It's set to rise more and more, faster and faster. So the future, whether we like it or not, is inextricably bound to the future of the city. What role will our cities from zero play? Are they part of a blueprint for a better world, or doomed, outdated models of an already extinct ideology? Another important reason that we felt it was we should do this day was to give a kind of focused, critical debate to these new cities that have often, so far, been talked about by the kind of bulk of Western critics in a tone that's a sort of mix between a sort of sneering superiority, quote, we did that kind of thing in the 1980s, unquote, to a kind of moral outrage, quote, it's so soulless, unquote. And I think that species of Western criticism is in itself something that has to be unpacked, cannot be taken for granted as a condition of certain other conditions. And we ask the question, might this self-elected snobbishness have anything to do with the fact that the future predictions of the 21st century predict that economic activity will end, the dominance of kind of economic growth is about to end in the West and is about to, of course, move to the Middle and the Far East, therefore leaving us here in the West perhaps trailing way behind. Is this one of the reasons that we feel it incumbent upon ourselves to denounce these new places with such vigor? So we had a hunch that it would be interesting to gather a group of researchers, architects, theorists and documenters to try and define the characteristics of these cities from zeros, and to map out, albeit in a very preliminary way, the various causes and effects that we will undoubtedly begin to see migrate to other places in the world. A lot of our, several of our guests have flown a long way to be here, so we're deeply grateful to all of them for giving their time and their attention. The way that the day works is very, very simple. You've seen in the timetable there'll be 3 half-hour presentations this morning. Then there'll be a plenary discussion between us and hopefully between the audience. Then we'll break for lunch. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock, similar kind of format, 3, and then a discussion. And I'd like to perhaps, before we kick off, express our thanks to Brett for being supportive of this endeavor, and to various incredible people here at the AA, such as Belinda Flaherty, to Joyita, and a whole host of other people that have been incredibly supportive. So to kick off, our first presentation this morning is by Neville Mars. Neville is an architect who had, for a number of years, worked at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam, and over the last few years has founded a kind of research initiative called the Dynamic City Foundation, which is based in Beijing, and has been doing an incredible amount of research and design proposals, interestingly, on the whole new kind of glut of urbanization taking place in China. So it gives me great pleasure to start the symposium with Neville Mars. Neville.
How's that? Well, thank you for having me. It's a real honor, and it's a great pleasure. Many people I haven't seen in a long time. The first thing I want to say, it's interesting. You say that thing about snobbishness. I walk in here and I see these presentations, and they're really completely mind blowing. And it's understandable that you have in the West a sort of a seed that nurtures these kind of attitudes, because the difference from, and it's so stark from me coming from China just right now, to with the presentations there, the thinking there, it is really mind-blowing. At the same time, I was just saying to my mom that there is no, there's almost no way to implement such high-level conceptual thinking here, other than maybe in an interior design or such, where in China they don't have time, of course, and they just plant down an entire new city. So between these two conditions, I think it is understandable, and I hope to somehow bridge this gap in my presentation. I had a title for my story. Urban China 2020, that's the official name for the research project that we've been doing for the last 3 years. The case 400, or the 400 fetish, was the title for this story. I just figured I should have called it From Zero to Hero, because this is the angle that I'm most recently sort of turning towards, where this criticism is becoming more and more difficult. Chinese cities are so effective in their way to become actually really modern, well-serviced, and indeed impressive. I'd like to start by reading a little introduction about from the book that relates to this topic. The idea for this research, and I assume that's the same for this forum today, was born out of a fetish. The mind-boggling numbers describing developments in China stir up a profound craving at the heart of most architects. The most impressive number I've come across has become the case study for the first project of the Dynamic City Foundation. The objective to construct 400 new cities by the year 2020, as stated by the Chinese Minister of Civil Affairs in 2001. Such big numbers constitute the resurrection of an architectural dream. Let me click on something. The resurrection of an architectural dream. The dream to design and define the world around us. The dream to build cities void of the miseries and mistakes accumulated over time. The dream to outsmart the failures of previous attempts to build cities from scratch. These big numbers exude the hypnotic seduction of development, not just in the margins, but of entire urban societies. This is a postcard from Shenzhen from the late 80s, where you clearly see this idea of modernism, the objective to build a city that looks like this. And then you can send it to your mom, grandma. I live in this new city, the most desirable place in the whole of China, and it still is, I think. And China aims to do nothing less than to reconstruct its societies from scratch. With the new building stock at the scale of Europe, China is in effect building a new continent for a new population, once rural, by 2020 completely urbanized. At a time when in the West urban planning seems obsolete, or at least painstakingly slow, ideas have to be generated to accommodate this mega-scale transition and the so-called mass migration from the countryside. However, the absurdity to build 400 cities, that's the goal stated by Deutsche Serang in 2001, is almost as stark as the aspiration to attempt their design, particularly when in reality they are growing and expanding naturally beyond the control of the planners. So these are roughly the cities in 2003. This is 20 new cities in 1 year. This would be 400 cities between 2001 and 2020. In reality, the plans often are lag behind with the reality. This is a scheme, and strangely enough, they presented with great pride for Beijing. I've made a very abstract sort of trace. For 2010, when in reality the footprint in 2000 is already that. So there's a speed and an immediacy that doesn't allow China to consider its future. They have to respond with instant buildings, cities, and answers. A fast reality that we like to respond to with a slow dream. Basically, when there is, when cities are growing beyond control and beyond design, the question arises, why are we doing this project? Secondly, most importantly today, what happened to all these new cities? First answer is simple. We made a number of design proposals that we hope to update very soon, and they should inspire a young generation of Chinese designers to contribute to this flash urbanization. Secondly, at the core of our understanding of Chinese flash urbanization lies the notion that it's the result of the combined forces of large top-down stepping stone projects and bottom-up, mostly unregulated growth or brickification. Today I want to present our findings that surprisingly both these forces contribute to new cities. So it's understandable that an instant city is new and should be considered as what we've coined a brand new city, but we're also seeing a process of bottom-up development, which we have mapped with a model called MOD, or market-driven organic development, and they too form an entirely new city. This is going to be the main gist of the story. These new items, these new cells, entirely planned from scratch and with great detail, far more detailed than we can, for instance, achieve. We're doing a real project now in Beijing, and even in the concept phase, they sort of require an image such as this. Together, these schemes, we're suggesting, still should be considered to contribute to an organic shape of the city. This is the central business district in Beijing in 2020, and it's very likely that it will be exactly like this. At the same time, throughout the countryside, a sort of bottom-up form of urbanization is taking place. I'll just give you a quick overview to get the sense of it. This is very close to my house, or my former house, Shenzhen. An entirely new city in the middle of nowhere. Can I go back? No. Near Chongqing, a mega city of 33 million if you follow the official statistics. This is an image of brickification, I'm sorry. So, two forces, bottom-up and top-down, together are the driving power of this flash urbanization. The question then is how to capture, how to define, how to distill what is the new Chinese city. We're starting with a very basic understanding of how the Chinese define a new city. My pronunciation is still wretched, and one of our partners, Zhang, is in the audience. I'm very embarrassed. But the Chinese word for city is Changshi. And this is particularly painful because my name in English, Neville, of course, comes from new city, new ville. So we've translated it to Chang, He Xin Chang. And nobody understands me when I present myself. This kind of pattern, this really splattered, sort of disconnected urban tissue, has to be somehow captured with formulas. The official Chinese approach is an array of different systems, political, demographic, and a combination of these. Political basically is 5-tiered, from top-down municipalities, only 4 of them, Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Chongqing, are megalopolis that have their autonomy directly under central government. Then prefecture-level cities or provincial-level cities, followed by sub-prefecture-level cities, county-level cities, and special administrative regions. Then, more and more importantly, is a distinction based on population. Basically, 10 million, 5 million, 2.5, 1, and less than 1 million. Now they coined a formula. I give you an example for a prefecture-level city that combines these aspects. To be a prefecture-level city, an urban center has to have a non-rural population of 250,000, a growth output of value of industry of 200 million RMB, and an output of tertiary industry of over 35% of the GDP that supersedes the primary industry. This is important because cities, based on a political definition, contain large amounts of farmers and rural economy and farmland. This is a reasonable formula. Let me fast forward. This is a reasonable formula that has generated a massive amount of new cities in the last 2 decades. This is a boring but important diagram that I'm going to run you through. In 1949, the birth of the People's Republic of China, there were just over 100 cities. Then the cities actually, the numbers start to decline. Only with the open door policy in '78, sort of immediate flash urbanization is the result. In fact, until 1998, 2 decades later, the number is so great that on average 23 new cities were built per year. That means that the current objective of 400 new cities by 2020 is actually less than the reality. I drew a little Coca-Cola bottle. We've coined this term called consumerbation, which ties together the idea of consumption and urbanization. In 1978, directly with the open door policies, Boeing and Coca-Cola sort of entered and took over the country. And one of the chapters tries to prove that there is a direct relationship with such consumption and urbanization. At 1998, you see the numbers decline again and then stabilize. This is also very odd, of course. What we've been finding, and the government is not so transparent about this or anything for that matter, is that the numbers, the definitions have been tweaked to keep that number level. I realize on a day like this that is painfully boring. We are here to talk about new cities, this obsession with newness, this instantness. When you talk about definitions such as those based on numbers, then cities simply grow to reach the critical mass, and then suddenly they are called cities. I have good news. There are a large amount of entirely, or as we coin it, brand new cities in China. In fact, we're suggesting that China is a new city nation. And not just on basis on such an area like here in the northeast of Beijing, which could be considered a tabula rasa, but it has been a new city nation since its inception, since its birth. In 1949, Mao was standing at Tiananmen Square and stated the following: the ambition, the hope to see a forest of chimneys from here. He suggested to convert the civic society that is Beijing, that is a city per definition, into a productive one, i.e. a tissue of factories or denwei production units. This installed concept or thinking that is from the start per definition anti-urban. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and thirdly the down the mountain to the village, I think Chang will correct me later, are three campaigns that at their heart try to undo the cities that then, after 5,000 years of culture, have emerged. The first cause is simply an amount of economic recessions that stopped urban growth. But then lastly, he sent more than 12.5 million people to the countryside, draining the city centers from their intellectual core. Secondly, the cities are simply extremely young. So these are a number of reasons why cities should, in fact all cities should in China, be considered new. The cities are no more than 2 to 3 decades old. If you look at a picture from Shenzhen in 2003, these are the sites that are under construction at that certain point in time. But even cities with a very long-standing history, such as Beijing or Shanghai, can be considered as almost entirely new. This is a map we've made of Beijing. This is the traditional core, the old center, with some leftover bits and blobs around it. This is the post-communist, or the new city from 1949. So even in the old parts, you see this very harsh contrast between old and new, such as here, and of course it's very evident the old is disappearing extremely quickly. I personally really like this image where you experience the different lifestyles either here in Hutong or in the new tower blocks. So there is an ambition to transform China as quickly as possible from a traditional communist to a modern society. And he's going to be part of that. In fact, anything is done to eradicate a connotation with the communist heritage. These are denwei, fairly late denwei in Beijing. This means that the thinking of the existing cities are also considering them as tabula rasa. The cities are, in that sense, they might as well be empty plains. This is a little sketch I just made, a new tower block on what used to be a hutong. So the society itself is under construction. The people are moving as quickly as possible from a fairly grim, poor condition to a moderately developed, to a Shaokang or middle class situation, the official goal for 2020, to a more and more upmarket one, such as these pictures show. We've introduced a notion of entirely new cities that should be distinguished from cities that just grow to become to achieve the definition of a new city. These brand new cities follow two aspects. One, they have at their core mostly a single brand, a single source for them to exist. This can be a tourist destination, a logistic hub, a mining field, a high-tech development zone, which is simply a political incentive to attract foreign investment, or satellite cities. For instance, in 1999, there were over 6,500 high-tech development zones in China. Those were for political reasons to try and curb the economy, then officially put a stop to, but only 2 years later the same number was in place again. These kind of high-tech development zones look something like this. This is for me becoming more and more important because it really shows a fairly bleak kind of environment is growing in the heart of the country. The development zones can be as big as an existing city. This is Chengdu. This is the outer ring of Chengdu. And this dotted line is the planned high-tech development zone. That doesn't mean there is a real city there yet. It means they have the incentive to draw in money to build a new city there, and they will. There's no spatial constraints, so these cities will be loose fit and fairly unregulated. In Beijing, Shanghai, we see a great number of satellites. Actually, the official numbers might not make them new cities, but we should consider them new cities if they range from 500,000 to over 1 million. These satellite cities for 2020 are the red dots here. 11 of them are planned around Beijing, making Beijing from what used to be a monocentric city in a sort of instant polycentric or forced polycentric city. This shift from a clear ringed city, what they call ringed city because it has 6 very big arteries around the core, to these new centers develops a tissue, an urban fabric that is even more scattered because it tries to mediate between these two conditions. The point being that even though new cities might be very hard to pin down, there are a lot of them, and the entire urban context is new. This is another example of a very large one planned almost instantaneously between Beijing here, it's very low res, and Tianjin here. A logistic hub. I don't understand why, because it's in the middle of nowhere, but apparently with enough momentum to attract investment of the scale of almost a new Manhattan. These are the gates of what they've coined Jing from Beijing and Jin from Tianjin. I'll show you some pictures, what that looks like. They don't give many pictures of the industrial core of this city, which is really the raison d'être and the largest amount of the surface. But the people that run the place will be living in these kinds of villas and playing golf here. That delivers us the notion of brand new cities also for the residential realm. We did a mini survey a while ago how these cities look. We call them cities without history because they try to implement this instant history, this instant sense of tradition by cladding the buildings with sort of a mix of neo-rococo, Renaissance, sort of stylistic cues. like this. And all this, of course, for what is at the same time an entirely new society, more so than just an environment that is changing. The key, I think, is to understand the logic behind it. China is changing its physical appearance in order to facilitate the societal shift. That's why foreigners tend to be more critical than the Chinese themselves. That's put really mildly. I realize that. Let's look at it from a more detailed, more professional standpoint. One chapter in the book is called PUC, The People's Urbanity of China, and it suggests that we should reconsider the density levels in China. It's clear the world is urbanizing. It's also clear China is absolutely the number one in speed and total scale. This is the current urban footprint in China, and it's adding the footprint of Beijing annually. The result is that in 34 years, the current urban footprint will be doubled. This is comparable to a 25-country large European Union. The causes, the real causes for this kind of urban expansion, sort of understanding urban growth not from these fairly contrived formulas, but the actual city expansion. On the one hand, simply natural population growth. On the other hand, migration. The natural population growth in China, of course, is a tricky one because nobody knows the numbers. The numbers vary amazingly. There are some people that assume China already has 1.8 billion people today. We are more cautious. We've set out all the numbers we can find, all the official numbers and people we find credible, and sort of mediated between them, which is this dot here, that pins it down at 1.55 billion in 2020. Then the migration. There's a surplus of rural people. There's no work for them. The farmland is decreasing. They are at the moment moving, albeit temporarily, to the cities. If you include natural population growth, that delivers us with 400 million new urbanites in 2020, which means that, according to our understanding, the initial goal, the statement that started this whole project of 400 new cities for 400 million people, is in fact correct. And the 400 new cities goal should be a real objective. So expansion based on increased footprint and migration. The migration, of course, as a result from an income gap between the poor areas in the hinterland and the richer cities. Where are they going? It's fairly easy to assume the migration is towards the most affluent places along the coastline and in these purple regions here on the map. At the same time, it's a myth, or I think I called it here, contrary to popular belief, the largest part of migration is local and temporary. This is important because at the moment all Chinese goals and policies are aimed to curb growth of the larger cities, or we're suggesting that's actually something they should hold on to. the migration process is what we've coined roll over. They move to the cities and move back again in 2-3 years. All the policies in place right now, and this is Chang's chapter, are aimed at curbing sprawl, but in reality enforcing it. The simple example is the urban registration that's still in place that doesn't allow people to move into the city when they have a rural registration. They end up in the periphery of the large cities. The second objective is even more astounding. There was an incentive for farmers to move to 20,000 villages, which would give them an instant urban hukou. This, of course, immediately sort of stimulates village-level urbanization. Here you see a sort of a map of the real areas where the growth is taking place. That means that these two cores, especially the smallest centers, are growing the fastest. These are the settlements with the least efficient urban footprint. Satellites at a national level, this zone fever, as it's called. We've introduced a whole number of terms that should capture this entirely new form of urbanization and try to mold it in this completely incomprehensible diagram. but the result is clear enough. It's scattered. It's very scattered. I'll come to the end very quickly. More importantly, this scattered urbanization is happening on a very, very small part of the entire city, the entire country. 96% of the population, the economic activities, migration flows, urban population, and arable land is with this red zone, what we've called PUC, or the People's Urbanity of China. Indeed, also 96% of the pollution. PUC forces us to reconsider the density numbers generally attributed to China. And in comparison to the US and Europe, it becomes much more important to consider China as an almost continuously urban context. In comparison to other countries, it's even more dense than Holland. These are the main areas in the world with more than 400 people per square kilometer. It's interesting that they almost touch each other. If you project the current form of urbanization, this would be the footprint that we can expect over the next 20 years. Especially the last one is really shocking. If urbanization continues at urban district density, you can simply project this giant square on top of PUC. So this is the current urban footprint, which would then extend to this shape because it's entirely scattered. Particularly poignant is this diagram where you see that the most densely populated areas and the most productive arable areas are exactly the same. Historically, this makes perfect sense, of course. If you overlap them, that means that China's arable land is mostly and directly under threat. Let's skip the... This area is a concentration in a concentration. We've coined it Jinhoo, which is the train line between Shanghai and Beijing. And we're suggesting it should be considered the capital of PUC. The agriculture, population density, industry, GDP, services all concentrate in this region. What we've done as a sort of final step for this chapter is streamline the current process and see what might emerge in the year 2020. First of all, looking at Jinhoo, we see it has an average density of 485,000 people per square kilometer. If you look at the ridge, what we've coined the urban ridge here, it's as much as 944 people per square kilometer, and a basin of 590. Oh, sorry, I got the numbers wrong. This is the urban ridge, and this is sort of the basin. The basin is a continuous, equal, dotted pattern or splatter pattern that covers the region. This is a satellite image, and we'll slowly zoom in on these squares. Every dot is a village, and the villages are doubling. They have in the last 20 years, and we're assuming that they continue to do so. That delivers a projection such as this, an almost entirely urbanized tissue. I'll skip the Shanghai aspect. Shanghai as a cluster of very large satellites. That means the total population and taking into consideration the density, this is a new metropolis. When we consider our case that started this whole project, the objective to build 400 new cities for 1 million people each by 2020, what we actually see emerging is one megalopolis of 400 million people. I think considering time, that's enough. If maybe there's time and interest, we can show a little movie what these new cities actually feel like later on.
Thank you very much, Neville. That's a brilliant way to start the morning. Next up we have Adina Temple. Adina is an architect and a researcher who studied in Germany and in New York. Between 2005 and 2006, she was an independent researcher at the American University of Sharjah, where she was preparing her project Dimension Dubai. She's currently working on a publication and an exhibition about Dubai with her partner and colleague, Mirko Urban. So we thought it would be, I mean, generally the sessions are kind of organized so that there's a bit of China, a bit of Dubai, compare and contrast, spot the difference, and then and then after that we'll have Frank. So once you're ready, Adina. Thank you.
Maybe directly from CD.
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's on Windows. Windows, yeah. It shouldn't be a problem.
Let me start the computer with me.
Ansonsten müssen wir halt meinen Rechner anschließen. Sonst müssen wir meinen Rechner anschließen. Wenn es nicht geht. Also, ich weiß nicht, worum es nicht geht. Maybe just first open PowerPoint and then load that in. It should work. It's not. No, first open that.
No, the other one. It's the other one.
That one.
Yes.
And one, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
We try my laptop. No.
So I might have the boards too. That's no problem.
Yeah. Do you have it on the?
No, I have it on the USB.
Yeah, then we check test this.
You don't have a lighter screen.
Hmm?
Is the screen this dark?
Yeah, it's a bit
Well,
dark.
that's okay, but I mean, can you see it?
Was he at film? No, it's okay. Don't worry, it's fine. We don't show the film. Okay. Alright. Okay, sorry for the delay. There was a problem with the technique or